Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Monday, March 18th, and today I'm going to be talking about a couple of transits that are perfecting this week and really throughout the rest of the month. And those are the transits of Venus in Aquarius, moving into a square with Mars in Taurus, and Mercury Retrograde, which is moving through its retrograde into a conjunction with Neptune. That conjunction with Neptune is going to be quite a big deal because Mercury's conjunction with Neptune will happen several times through its retrograde, its stationing, and then its forward movement. You got a lot of engagement between Mercury and Neptune. And then this week, again, on top of it, we have Venus in Aquarius moving into a square with Mars and Taurus. So the dynamics of each of these transits individually, but also what they might mean collectively, is going to be the focus of my talk for today. So let's begin by giving you a little sense of the details of the transit and the timeline. Venus is in Aquarius right now and is at about 20 degrees of Aquarius, and Mars is at about 21 degrees of Taurus. Now, of course, Mars in Taurus is hanging out in the sign of Venus, and of course that's a little bit of a difficult position for Mars. It's called the exile of Mars, or the detriment, sometimes we call it. And all of the planets work like that. Whenever they're in the signs opposite to their own, they're in an archetypal landscape that's in some ways fundamentally different from their own natural landscape. So whenever Mars is in Aries, it feels at home. Whenever it's in Scorpio, it feels at home. When you put it in the opposite signs of Libra or Taurus, then Mars is hanging out in Venus's signs, so it gets a little bit uncomfortable. That's not to say that there isn't a lot to learn from the transit, that it can't be effective, but it's cluing us into something about the archetypal relationship between planets that takes place. Planets don't always have to be in aspect with one another in the sky in order to have some kind of relationship. They also relate to one another by virtue of being in each other's signs. So Mars right now is in Taurus at 21 degrees. Venus, meanwhile, is in the 10th whole sign from Taurus, which is Aquarius at 20 degrees. And that square is going to perfect over the next few days. They're both moving along, right? So it's going to take Venus all the way up until about Thursday of this week, at least that's East Coast time, USA, before Venus catches and makes perfects the square to Mars. And then you give it about 3 degrees of separation and you're all the way till the end of the week. So, more or less you have a Venus-Mars square this week. Now, Venus-Mars squares you could talk about from this kind of a standard way of talking about Venus-Mars squares, the dance of the masculine and the feminine, and they're the sort of illicit lovers of Greek mythology, Ares and Aphrodite. Like they, love and strife have an interesting relationship with one another archetypally. Mars being the god of war and related to strife, and Venus, of course, being related to harmony and love. But they're, in some ways, they're shadow or secret lovers with one another. And there was one of my favorite books that was written by James Hillman was a book called Terrible Love of War. And in that book, he really looks at the secret sort of shadowy relationship between Venus and Mars. So if you ever want to read a great book about that, check that one out. I am going to be reading a little something from Hillman later today, but just a brief snippet. Okay, so that's where Venus and Mars are heading over the course of the next week. Meanwhile, there's another transit that's happening we're also going to be looking at today, which is Mars's retrograde into a conjunction with Neptune. And here's how that's looking. So Mercury is going to retrograde. Right now, it's about 20 Pisces. So it's passed over the conjunction with the sun by its retrograde and is now moving into the morning star position. It's not visible yet, but it will be gradually as it gains more distance from the sun through its retrograde. It gradually starts appearing in the eastern sky in the morning as the morning star. So as that's happening right now in Pisces, Mercury is going to back into a conjunction with Neptune, and it's going to do so by about the end of the week. So you have Venus-Mars square coming through this week as Neptune is starting to engage in a conjunction, or as Mercury is starting to engage in a conjunction with Neptune, which perfects, make sure I've got this exactly right, it's really perfecting between a Sunday of this coming week, the 24th, into the 25th. And then Mercury is going to station at 16 degrees, which is the same degree that Neptune's at right now. And it's going to do so by, the 27th, 28th, right around there, turns direct by the end of the month. And then at the very beginning of April, it's still within a degree of Neptune. And it doesn't pass over Neptune finally until basically April 2nd. So if you can imagine between now, and if you give it a couple of more degrees, like 3 degrees of separation, you're looking at all the way until April 7th. So imagine, just kind of sit with that for a moment. We are now entering a little corridor where between, say, let's say, middle of this week, all the way until April 7th, Mercury will be in that engagement range that ancient astrologers paid so much attention to, 3 degrees. 3 degrees within perfecting, separating was very important. So this is a long period of time for Mercury to be hanging out with Neptune. That's the point. And that's why I'm talking about it a little bit today. The bigger question, which I won't try to, I'm not going to try to give you a full treatment of this, is also, okay, so how do these two transits go together? And that's difficult because at that point, then you're really combining 4 planets and they're not perfectly synced up, but they're kind of happening at the same time. One's kind of leading and building into another. So I'll try to answer some of that at the very end. What I'd like to talk about first is Venus's square to Mars. In order to understand this particular square, not all planetary dynamics are the same. So sometimes there's a little bit of a misunderstanding, I think, in archetypal astrology, like modern archetypal astrology, that and not everyone makes this, but you'll see this commonly made, this mistake, I think, where any kind of planetary aspect between, any 2 planets is roughly, you're just combining the same ingredients regardless of what kind of aspect they have to one another. If it's a sextile, if it's a square, if it's an opposition. But actually the aspectual relationships really qualify the type of, the specific relationship that the 2 planets or more will have with one another. So in this case, for example, it's very significant, the exchange of dignity or reception between the planets. And it's also very important that Venus is in what we call the superior position. So let's discuss those things one by one. As I mentioned at the beginning, Mars is in Venus's sign right now. So when you're a house guest in someone's home, they owe you something. They owe you hospitality. But you're also in a powerless position because you're not in charge. You're not in control. So Venus is obligated to Mars right now to be a good host, right? But Mars is not exactly comfortable in Venus's terrain. Like, have to ask, what does Mars want, right? Mars wants blood. Mars wants war. Mars wants to confront or to divide or to penetrate or to sever. Mars wants bravery and courage and muscle. Like, these are just a short list. So if Mars wants those things, but is hanging out in earthy Venusian Taurian land and is requesting, those are his needs, you might say, Venus has to take care of them, right? So you can see how it might be a little bit awkward. Venus is like, well, how about we sing a song and go for a nice walk in nature, or something like that, right? So it's not an easy match, but nonetheless, Venus is obligated to give something to Mars as the host of Taurus. And so we always have to look when a planet's passing through Taurus at where Venus is to determine what kinds of things Mars is going to get, or put another way, the specific way in which Mars is likely to behave given Venus's placement. So Venus in this case is in the superior square. What does that mean? Well, it's a square relationship between the two. We know that squares are of the nature of Mars. How can you tell this? Because take, for example, when you look at the Thema Mundi, the original sort of chart of the world that ancient astrologers used, and you look at the positions of the sun and the moon, and then you draw out the aspects from the moon on the left side, going out from the left of the moon, so to speak, and from the right of the sun, and you get to their squares. The sun's square is to Scorpio, which is Mars ruled, and the moon's square is to Aries, which is Mars ruled. So we say that the square is of the nature of Mars. So we have a little bit of a contentious or dynamic or, yeah, those are two good words, a kind of confrontational energy between Venus and Mars right now. But because Venus is in not just any square, but what we call the superior square, this changes the nature of the relationship. A superior square happens when Venus is in the 10th sign from whatever planet she's making a square to. So in this case, the 10th sign from Taurus is Aquarius. One of the ways in which this position has been described is Robert Schmidt, the translator of ancient Greek text, used the word decimation. And the word decimate, it sounds like, you know, it sounds like a freaky word, but actually the word deci at the beginning had the meaning to either to extract a 10% offering or tithe or something like that, or also to kill one of every 10 soldiers within a group of soldiers in order to punish the group as a whole. But it has the meaning to almost like to exact a toll upon whatever planet the planet that is upon the 10th is square to. Well, Venus is upon the 10th, or in the position of the superior square over Mars right now, while Mars is in Venus's home. So what does that mean? Well, on one level, what we're saying is that my phone's buzzing. Let me turn it off. So on one level, what we're saying is that although Venus is the host and must give something to Mars, she's also in a unique position where she has the power to demand a lot of Mars. So let's put the position like this. Yesterday, to understand this more deeply, I did an I Ching reading, and I was sitting and contemplating the I Ching reading in relationship to Venus's superior square over Mars right now. And the hexagram that came back was number 46, which is called upward mobility. And in the picture of upward mobility, there's a lot of different images that go with it, but one of them is of a tree that's growing gradually upward. And a lot of the meaning of that particular hexagram has to do with the way in which people with power or strength or resources might feed or nourish or give support to someone that is lower on the totem pole in order to raise them up, but they may be doing so for selfish reasons. For example, yesterday when I was driving to my in-laws' place for dinner with my kids, I stopped to get gas, and there was a sign on the road, and it said, what did it say? It said, like, real estate agent seeks eager students, $5,000 to $10,000 a month, or you could earn $5,000 to $10,000 a month. And I thought, okay, so here we have someone that's on high, that is tempting someone that is down low with a promise of something great or something wealthy or some form of success, enticing them, say, you know, come and I will help you get to this, right? And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's a very and I go by this place all the time. The sign had just gone up because this is where I get my gas, right? So I was like, yeah, that's, you know, someone just put that up, and it's interesting that's coming as I was just reading this hexagram this morning and thinking about this. So when help comes from above to support what is below and wants to lift it up, a lot of the times in life when that happens, we're like open arms, like give me some help, you know, whatever is there to help me, I'll take it. I'll take the upward movement. So Venus right now, among many other things, I'm going to mention a few different archetypal scenarios, but one of the things that Venus is doing is extending some kind of deal. Like, okay, Mars, you're a guest in my home. I know I have to oblige you here, but I'm in the superior position. So I'll give you something, but I have a price. Right, so it's this kind of an exchange. What are we willing to compromise or sacrifice for the sake of success? What do we want or desire, and what are we allowing to pull us along? What are we following? What do we allow to guide our thoughts, our actions, or our motivations in the world? And is it coming from a good place or a selfish place? Like I'm imagining, I don't know this would be the case, but I'm imagining this young student going in and this person saying something like, look, I just really want to help young people. You can imagine it, right? I just really want to help young people. I just really want to help people, move up and realize their talent. And so it sounds pretty virtuous, right? It sounds really noble, but actually, after you start working for this person for a while, turns out you're not making that much money. You're making a little bit. They're making most of it. You're kind of doing the grunt work, and you feel a little taken advantage of. And it turns out that all those noble intentions that were presented to you, I'm just here to help young people, maybe not so true. Maybe this was something, a facade that was presented. So similarly, we have to be very careful right now, because on the dark side of this transit, the presentation of some kind of facade that we can that we're motivated by someone on high or something on high that looks noble, beautiful, good, true, worthy, etc., which Venus can present. She can be very alluring in that way, especially in sort of high-minded Aquarius. And so then Mars will say, okay, well, I'll go to work for that. I'll fight for that. I'll put my back into that. Think of good Mars in an Earth sign kind of endeavors. I'll go ahead and do that. Can't forget right now, of course, Mars is simultaneously hitting trines, just moved out of a trine to Saturn, is currently moving into a trine with Pluto, and that's going to happen. Let me just get that straight. That'll happen between now and Wednesday. So you can see how some very high, lofty, noble, good-sounding thing that could really reward you, really benefit you, may bring you into action, Mars, and you could work very hard with a lot of disciplines, trying to Saturn, with a depth and intensity, trying to Pluto. I'm really putting my back into it right now because I've got the possibility to move up. Do you see how that works? So, or it's flattery. Oh, look at how great you are. You're becoming so great, or you could become so great if again, like I just really want to help you. I want to help students, right? So the temptation, in other words, to put all of our effort and intensity into something that we believe is high and noble. But remember, the planet in the superior square often it takes something from us. It's going to extract something of our own work. So, there's that saying in the dating world, I just want friends with benefits, and a lot of people really sort of don't like that, like I'm not looking for friends with benefits here. I'm looking for a committed relationship. We want reciprocity in life where there's an exchange, there's mutual respect and some sense of equality. There's something about Venus in the superior square with a lot of power over Mars right now. And Mars, is the guest. Mars also has his needs. It's not an exactly equal relationship. And so we should just think about that and be mindful about what we're putting our energy and efforts toward. Because it's possible that even to just be led along by our own promises and selfish desires, and to mask from ourselves, to be not in touch with our true motivations, to not understand why we're being led to do something in the way that we are, and to mask it behind ideas or images of beauty or nobility or honor or things like that. This gets down to a deeper potential division that exists sometimes between our ideas of beauty and the connection between beauty and justice, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Beauty and justice go hand in hand, and beauty and truth, and also the sense of there being moral consequence in life. This is not something that is divorced from the beautiful or the good. And the possible karma behind this planetary transit, at least one of them that I was identifying yesterday in the I Ching, and the way that the I Ching was addressing this transit was in terms of the way that upward mobility towards something that looks good and beautiful and true may not in fact be that way. So being careful of that. One of the two lines in the hexagram 46, upward mobility, that were changing was the fifth line and the third line. The fifth line of that hexagram depicts someone taking step by ethical, persevering step toward a good, and the sweat, blood, and sacrifice that it may take to work toward something that is good and honorable, and that there is a sacrifice required, and that we have to tithe something of our own existence to work for things that are truly worth our time. And that's a part of this transit as well. So there is, again, possibility to be kind of methodically, carefully moving toward the good. And so it's not just being deceived by false images of goodness and then kind of plodding on selfishly toward them, or being seduced by offers of success and then, moving in somewhat manipulative or self-serving ways. But it's also the actual integrity that it takes to move in a methodical, earthy, structured, but intense and driven way, Mars, Saturn, Pluto, toward an ideal of beauty, truth, and goodness, which Venus also can represent. So that was the fifth line. However, the second line was also changing, or the third line, excuse me, and the third line of hexagram 46 very specifically shows one going step by step by step, like climbing the ladder, but more like social ladder climbing, where you're trying to become famous or powerful or knowledgeable, or you're trying to become the most well-known astrologer, the most well-known psychologist, or you're trying to blend how intellectually sophisticated you are with how cultured you are, and how, like, all these ways that subtly selfishness starts to dominate us. And so this version of the ladder climber in line 3 progresses into an empty city, a wasteland, a city filled with ghosts, a post-apocalyptic zombie city, and there's nothing there. And so the teaching here between these two lines has to do with the way that we climb methodically upward towards some good, and either arrive at the real thing or find that our ambitions were self-serving and therefore the results are hollow. They don't give us happiness. They deepen our sense of isolation and alienation from others and from ourselves. So there's a fine line between those two things right now that we could look for in our lives, in our relationships, at work, and so forth. Now, when we take that, take that transit and sort of bracket it, okay? The other big transit that's happening right now, which I promised we'd talk about, is Mercury's retrograde with Neptune. So this transit's also, again, because this transit is moving to perfect later this month, but is really in effect now from this week all the way till about the 7th of April, when you have that 3-degree engagement range. This is something that what I'm about to talk about is, in a sense, going to be living on a bit longer than this week's Venus-Mars transit. So the Venus-Mars transit is about a week. But then, all the way, you think about this next one, you're talking all the way into like April 7th. Mercury's currently retrograde, which in Western astrology is thought to be a somewhat debilitated condition. Planets like to move forward in direct motion, which represents something of their own agency and autonomy, their own sort of archetypal independence. When they start moving retrograde, they fall into the primary motion of the sky, or the diurnal motion, and they're swept up in something bigger. They lose the plot a little bit. Sometimes it represents reversals of fortune, delays. It can represent giving back something that's been gained. It can represent a general weakening of the normal archetypal functions, you might say, of the planet, where those functions are just less able to operate in a smooth, sort of forward-running manner. They're unusual, or sometimes it feels as though we've lost our ability to stay in control of things. Okay, so Mercury is a little debilitated in that sense. Of course, always a lot to learn from Mercury retrogrades, but sometimes they take away our control over things. So Mercury's retrograde, but it's also in its fall and in its exile in Pisces. What does this mean, and why is this the case? Well, you go all the way back to the Hellenistic tradition, and one of the things that was said about a planet in its exile is that, and remember, exile means it's in the sign opposite to its own. So Virgo is Mercury's natural home place of rulership and exaltation. It's in its fall, and therefore also exile or detriment in Pisces, the opposite sign. So anytime a planet is in its opposite sign, the oppositions in astrology, look at the opposition to the sun and the opposition to the moon in the Thema Mundi, both to Saturn-ruled signs, Capricorn and Aquarius. So the oppositions are of the nature of Saturn, and they represent something about separation. Saturn separates, Saturn divides. Saturn, not like Mars that severs, cuts, and penetrates. Saturn has more of the sense of isolating or removing or separating things and dividing things, in terms of placing a wall between one thing and another. So when you put a planet in its opposite environment, it's as though you're putting it on the other side of the wall that it's used to being on. And so it's kind of a stranger in a strange land. In fact, the natural place of planetary oppositions will often indicate something about a person or some aspect of the native's life occurring in a foreign place. That's one of the traditional meanings of a planet being in its exile or opposite sign. You'll, for example, in my own chart, the moon is in Capricorn, which is its exile, in the 9th house, higher-minded stuff, or religion or spirituality. And the main two forces in my life spiritually have come from India and South America, right? Ayahuasca shamanism and yoga. And so, and of course, I've traveled to those places, and they have meant a good deal to me. But that is, of course, in some ways, that journey has taken me outside of the comfortable place in which I grew up, which was a Christian church, right? So it sent me to a foreign land. And of course, there was my first book that I wrote was all about the difficulties of sort of deconditioning myself in some ways with some of the elements of Christianity that I grew up with. So exiles often put us in foreign environments, places that we're not exactly used to. So for that reason, we have to remember that Mercury right now is in a foreign place. It's not exactly its home country. That also has to do with the fact that, Mercury is in Jupiter's sign, and the kind of relationship that Mercury and Jupiter have is also one of kind of oppositional or archetypal opposites in some ways. Mercury likes to break down, analyze, and throw things up in the air for debate or question. Jupiter likes to confirm, say yes, and build bigger holes. So they have kind of opposite archetypal natures. When you look at the status of Mercury in Pisces, you also get its fall. Exaltations and falls are related to the moon and to peaks of fortune, things that go up really high and things that come down really low in life. And that's a natural cycle for everything. Everything in life circles through, goes through cycles of ups and downs. Your weight, your hormones, your moods, your money, So when Mercury is in Virgo, it's also considered to be exalted, sort of at a peak of fortune. And then it's in its fall, it's sort of pit or greatest decline of fortune when it is in Pisces. One of the things that I think it was Rhetorius said about Mercury in Pisces is he said, why is it that where Mercury is depressed in Pisces, there Venus is exalted? And why is it that where Venus is depressed in Virgo, there Mercury is exalted? And he goes on to say that it's because Venus is related to the sensual body and to desire and to appetite, the material world, beauty, flowers, you think of essential oils, aromatherapy, like touch, massage, sex, beauty, love, music, right? This kind of world is Venus's world. And he says, in Pisces, that's the time of year where spring is coming and those things are increasing. They're reaching their peak. So Venus is exalted there. But in Virgo, where the autumn is taking over and it's a dry, earthy place, there Venus is depressed. And the reason that Mercury is exalted in Virgo has to do with the fact that as autumn and the darkness is on the rise, there the intellectual rises up. The reason being more critical, being more objective, seeing stark differences between things. That element, that sort of archetypal faculty, is more associated with the dry movement into the yin time of year and the harvest. And then, so understandably, Mercury is depressed in the opposite sign where the sensual is on the rise. So the sensual and the intellectual have a kind of archetypal opposition to one another. So for that reason, we say that right now Mercury is in a little bit of trouble, right? Mercury is retrograde under the beams of the sun, which is a little bit difficult, though recovering now as the morning star. But also in its exile and in its fall. So now all of that may sound like, a lot of times people just hear that and they're like, oh, so is it just really bad? But no, we have to read these things so very carefully to think about what's actually happening. Here are some things that you could think about right now that, just generally speaking, that could be happening. First of all, this means that your reasoning capacity may go down as the imaginative capacity of fantasies, hopes, longings, your appetites, your material desires are rising and sort of clouding the rational mind. So that's one basic meaning that we have from this position of Mercury right now. Now, of course, that's going to be totally amplified on one level. The potential for that to be amplified in a really challenging way by a conjunction to Neptune, which is a planet that's related to, otherworldliness, fantasy, the imagination, the seeking of greater unity, the garden paradise image. Mercury already being churned up by the desirous, exaltation of Venus, Pisces, is now going into, is moving through a conjunction for a few weeks now with sort of lofty, beautiful Neptune, right? So potential for our better reasoning to be flooded by somewhat potentially irrational, imaginative longings, sensual desires that are, not incredibly well reasoned. It could take us off track. So, but on the other hand, is it not true that sometimes in order to access knowledge, beauty, truth of a higher order, that we need to be put into a position where our rational control over things is broken down, that it falls apart on some level? Isn't there some potential here for our minds to be, our rational doubts to be filled with faith, our rational sense of the need for control to be flooded with the reminders of beauty and harmony and pleasure. You know, why should there be such a divide between the mental and the imaginative, between the intellectual and the beautiful? Why should there be such a divide? Is there even really such a divide, or is that something that we tend to, you know, that we tend to hold up within ourselves? Is it a divide that where some synthesis could be brought together? So these are the general things that we're talking about in the weeks to come. I want to talk very briefly about the word discipline. This is a good time to think about whether or not we have mental discipline. But what does discipline mean, really? Because sometimes you'll say, oh, Mercury, Neptune, you could get really irrational, so mental discipline. And that, you know, it just sounds like what you're saying is basically like, yeah, just watch out for Neptune, watch out for anything imaginative or sparkly, because that's irrational, and irrational is bad, right? So it sounds kind of linear. It's like, well, you know, what does that really mean? So when we say that we may need to learn better mental discipline, what do we really mean by that? How can we get something out of that that goes a little deeper and bring some synthesis here? The word discipline etymologically has a punitive history in some ways, right? It has a relation to penitential chastisement, punishment for the sake of correction, martyrdom and suffering, right? Like that. But it also has a root level connection to the idea of disciple and discipleship. And what is a disciple? It comes from Latin discipulus, which means pupil, student, or follower. And the idea of being a follower is particularly interesting, because when we say have mental discipline, what if we imagine that rather than mental strictness, what if we imagine discipline as something that asks for us to follow something? What does it look like when we are followers, dedicated, devoted to something and following something? Well, in one sense, the reason that this might be a better way of thinking about it is because when we pit devotion and love and beauty and imagination against reason in terms of our need for truth and order, and, you know, because what we're talking about here is basically not wanting the mind to get lost, right? So we say mental discipline. But sometimes in a sort of modern sense, in a very empirical sense, we think that coming to the truth and knowing what to do or being intelligent, that we think that we come to truth by arresting or taking truth in a possessive, invasive, or a cutting and almost dissecting kind of way, that we take truth from nature, right? We grab the animal, we put it in a cage, we cut it up, we study it, right? So insofar as we think of rationality and we think of reason as something that's hard and strict and punitive and cutting and analytical, and what we're really doing is we're thinking of our approach to truth and reason to bring order into our life. We're thinking of it from the standpoint of taking something. But the word discipline can also have that meaning of to be a disciple, to be a follower. So how do we come to knowledge or truth, which can bring order and keep us from chaos or irrationality in the negative sense, making really bad decisions or following fantasies that just aren't true? If we look for truth from the spirit of humility, if we're a seeker from a humble place, if we find teachers and paths in life that we can give ourselves to, we can submit ourselves to in a humble and receptive mood, that does not mean that we lose our rationality. In fact, one of the best ways to keep that sense of needing to stay strict is to follow something, but to merge the following with the heart, with humility, and with surrender. So when we become humble students of life, when we become humble but inquisitive students, we can ask questions. We can use our doubts and our questions to triangulate in on the truth a little bit closer. One of my teachers likes to say that, use that phrase, triangulate. You let your doubts help you triangulate in on the truth. But he also always says, you know, make sure that the way that you ask questions to the universe, so to speak, is in a humble and submissive manner. And when we do that, we're not saying, well, it's my strictness and my sort of militant mindset that's going to go and extract and take truth, right? So this idea of having mental discipline to help us through the potential fog or haze of the weeks ahead, I'm suggesting that we think about that word discipline in terms of the meaning of a disciple, that I'm a disciple of truth. I ask questions, but I do so from a spirit of modesty, surrender, humility, respect. And when we do that, the universe has a way of providing us with the correct answers. Because we're in a position that's receptive, we can be in a place to receive the appropriate reasoning that we might need. So this is a different way of thinking how to approach the potential haziness or fog that can come with a Mercury-Neptune transit. Some people will say, oh, be really strict, be really grounded in your mind. But again, if all we mean is we're going to go and sort of try to take and try to extract truth in some aggressive manner, not only will we tend to be, that can only last us so long. Right? Because then what we're trying to do is build a platform for ourselves. Well, I feel confident and I feel good because, you know, I'm in possession of the truth. But actually, mental discipline has a lot to do with recognizing that you're not in possession of anything, just like Socrates, who said that the unexamined life isn't worth living. But also we have the fact that Socrates asked more questions than anything, you know. So mental discipline really has a lot to do with humility of the mind, the path of following. So let's think about that. And why is that good for Mercury Neptune? Because this can actually be a very healing time for the mind in terms of surrendering our mind to follow, to inquire, to be smart, but to follow and to be in a humble state with how we approach the quest for knowledge or truth. And that can also steer us clear of making too many assumptions, you know, getting taken away by fantasies or delusions, do you know what I mean? Or smelling the roses and losing our head, right? So it's not some kind of rigorous mental quality that's needed to stave off the potential illusion of Mercury Neptune. It's a humble mind and an eager heart together that that help us triangulate and move toward move through our questions and our doubts toward truth. That's a lesson of Mercury Neptune. That's a gift that Mercury Neptune gives us. So now the other thing is that at some point when we inquire with a humble mood and a humble spirit, but we inquire about truth, that other thing is that when we're receptive, when truth comes through to us in a receptive position rather than an aggressive position, the other thing that tends to come through is the goddess, right? This is where Venus comes back into the picture right now, because if we're in a humble, respectful, and sort of submissive or receptive position with our inquiries and trying to stay home on what is true right now, in that receptive position, when truth comes in, truth comes down from above. There's a feeling of being in reception of something higher. And when we're in the receptive position, Venus comes right in through. So that's why ancient philosophers said that whatever is true of the highest nature of truth is also simultaneously beautiful. When you make yourself receptive to higher truth and you inquire of it and you ask, you petition, you say, what is it? What is the truth? But you know you're coming from the position of I don't know. So please tell me, please show me. When it comes through, when it comes down, when you're receptive, then you can receive the goddess who flows through grace and comes with true knowledge. So truth, the highest truth, is also beautiful. And when we have something that's true and beautiful. The other quality that ancient philosophers associated with the true and the beautiful was the good or the just. So that which is good and that which is true and that which is beautiful all go together. So, and this, again, all of this really comes from not so much the need to stay away from fantasies right now and keep the mind grounded, but to inquire what is of a higher nature of truth. And then we find that what comes along with it is not just the discernment that we need to get through the fog, but also the image of what is beautiful and what is good. And that bridges the imagined division between the sensual and the intellectual. This is where the fusion can occur, where what is true and what is intelligent is also completely magnificently beautiful and also just and good and moral, so to speak, of a spiritual standard of goodness. So these things go together. We like to artificially separate them, and this is why we find that sometimes there are these archetypal divisions, why we have a language of dignities to tell us that Mercury sometimes struggles in this position. It really has to do with the way in which we tend to receive what appear to be archetypal contradictions. Of course, they're all held together in eternity. If we're eternal and the soul, it partakes in eternity, then the soul is the place in which what appear to be archetypal opposites can come together in meaningful ways. They don't contradict each other anymore. And this is also the meaning of a conjunction in astrology. A conjunction always gives us the ability to bring those things together. So here's, I want to read you a little passage from one of my favorite Hillman essays, which is called Aphrodite's Justice. It's just a little, what do you call them? I don't know, like a little essay. Anyway, I really like this little passage. He says, the unhappy relation between psychology and beauty. It's the same kind of thing, right? Sometimes in therapy, and I hear people say this when they come into astrology sessions sometimes. They'll be like, well, good luck figuring me out, or good luck figuring my chart out, like I'm a head case, or, you know, like that. And they're joking, of course, but and similarly, sometimes you go to therapists or whatever, and we say, well, I hope you can analyze me and figure me out, right? So Hillman's kind of coming from the standpoint of like, you know, sometimes psychology is so analytical, it gets a little divorced from this idea of beauty. So here's what he says. He says, the unhappy relation between psychology and beauty results from a wider problem in the Western mind. Classical and philosophical thinkers, even those studying antiquity, mainly German and British, of course, and Christian, the Romantics being the great exceptions, have simply avoided work on Aphrodite. Sometimes regarding her not even a true goddess, certainly not deserving of Olympus, and of course immoral and unethical. Venus has been trapped in a basic Christian dilemma that divides beauty from goodness and truth. Splitting the classical idea of kalokagathon, I think I'm saying that right, beauty and goodness held in one term. After splitting them from each other, importance is given to the moral order, which sets up Venus as an immoral disturbance, an outlaw. She becomes a Carmen, a destructive temptress. The long history of Christianized philosophy has driven ethics from aesthetics, justice from beauty, so that we customarily believe that you cannot be both good and beautiful, ethical and alluring. Nor can the pleasures of the senses be the path to truth. This is particularly true in, for example, in the path of Bhakti Yoga, where Bhakti Yoga, which I personally practice, one of the main things that we say is that we're very concerned with people who say that your emotions should be done away with if you're to really find enlightenment, or your imagination, or art, or beauty, or love. So Bhakti is really about a yoga that is inclusive of emotionality. It sees the sort of the idea of samadhi, of being absorbed in something higher, and bhakti has a lot to do with absorption of the heart and the emotions and the mind and the imaginative faculties, all connected with divinity because they're thought of as divine in origin. So Hillman is saying essentially the same thing. He's sort of, I consider Hillman something of a psychological bhakta. At any rate, he says, a piece of art or a novel may be recommended for its moral instruction in In its morality lies its beauty. But never does the Christian divide admit that in its very beauty is its morality. Since beauty works as a calling to better things, pulling at the heart to love, to the mind to imagine more vividly. Moreover, morality without beauty stifles both heart and mind. Boring, dull, it does not take hold, does not prompt the justice it advocates. In fact, Saul Bellow, Nobel laureate novelist, said, "Dullness is worse than obscenity. A dull book is wicked. It may be as nice as pie and as sweet as can be, but if it is banal and boring, it is evil." So shall we be steeping around psychology and philosophy both and turn back to the mythic figures in search of Aphroditic justice? I really love that passage, and it gets to the point about Mercury getting into the conjunction with Neptune in its fall, in its exile. Because again, what did they say in ancient times? Why is it that where Mercury is depressed, their Venus is exalted? And why is it that where Mercury is exalted, their Venus is depressed? And it's said because where the appetites and the desirous and the sensual increase, there the intellect decreases. And where the intellect increases, there the sensual decreases. But the truth is that these archetypal divides have to do with how we tend to hold them in our minds and in our humanity. And the call, the secret truth of astrology, in my opinion, is that we can work what appear to be these archetypal opposites that forever shall remain across the boundaries, the opposition of Saturn. They are apart. There's a wall. But actually, there is the opportunity to bring those things into deeper and more meaningful harmony. Hence, again, the idea of not just, let's not get lost right now mentally. We could become really ungrounded, which is true, but also let's become not when we say let's become mentally disciplined, we get into that word of disciple, and the idea of a disciple being a follower, being somebody who seeks the truth from the heart. And when that seeking from the heart is there, and we use our doubts to triangulate in on the truth from a humble, a humble position, when we come to receive something of higher knowledge, because we're in a receptive mood, not an aggressive empiricist, let me take truth and make sure I stay grounded. But when we receive in that way, along with our reception, our inquiry into higher truth, when we finally get something of higher knowledge, along with it comes beauty and goodness. Beauty and goodness, and not goodness in some cowboy Western kind of way. We're not John Wayne goodness here. We're talking about a goodness that's subtle, that it's not a big pronouncement in the city square kind of goodness. So at any rate, I hope that this has been an interesting way of thinking about the conjunction between Mercury and Neptune, which is now with us really all the way a ways into April. So when you approach faith and questions of what we believe in, or what is true, how should I discern the correct way forward? When you approach it from the standpoint of pure reason, separated from beauty, separated from imagination, like that, you can only get to, yes, I objectively believe that's true, or no, I believe that's false, right? And it's very mechanical. If we can recall that truth is also good, just, and beautiful all at once, then we must realize that for the intellect to arrive at something true, the heart and the imagination also have to be involved. They also have to come together. That's the great opportunity that we have in front of us the next couple of weeks with Mercury and Neptune together. Okay, and be careful of making completely ridiculous decisions based on, total fantasies, because I don't, just being real cookie cutter, like cookbook here, Mercury, Neptune, you can lose your reasoning faculty. Like it can be just that simple and kind of mundane. So now I promised you at the end that I would try to say something about how Venus and Mars, they're square, and this Mercury retrograde with Neptune go together, because guess what? They do go together. They're not in a vacuum. The trines from Mars to Saturn and Pluto that we talked about earlier, they're happening in sextiles with Sun, Mercury, Neptune. This is all happening in the sign of Venus's exaltation. while Venus is square to Mars. So they're all engaged with one another right now. So one of the things that the way that I would put these things together would be to search for the higher truth right now with your heart, with your mind, in a mood of surrender and honest inquiry, being gentle and humble, and but seeking for something higher, keeping your imagination and your heart on board. If you do that, it's going to be easier to stay aware of what higher things are worth striving for, are worth putting your efforts into right now. And if you're not being a bit of a seeker right now, and if you're not trying to inquire after higher truth, the likelihood of deceiving ourselves that something good and beautiful and true or noble is worth going after when it's actually quite self-centered, I think is there. So I think it's a moment where we could easily convince ourselves that something that appears true, beautiful, and good is actually very self-serving. It's not a part of an honest inquiry into higher truth. That could take over right now. On the other hand, again, with a honest and I think humble inquiry, some sense of what is really worth aspiring for and where our allies are, or what help is worth receiving or taking from others, I think that can also come through. So sorry, this last part was a little choppy compared to the first part. I didn't have as much time to think through the synthesis of the two transits as I did, each piece. I'd love to hear your thoughts as you go through the next couple of weeks, as to how this turns out. I will be back with another video later this week to talk about the spring equinox, which is going to be really interesting because right as the spring equinox occurs, it's a full moon, and the sun is also going to get into a conjunction with Chiron right away, as it's just newly in Aries. So I think this full moon has the potential to be kind of action-packed. So I'll come back and talk about that too. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I'm going to look and see if there's any questions that I missed, and then we'll be done for the day. How to triangulate? Yes. Well, that's a great question, Cheryl, and I mean probably bigger than what I could say, in a short answer. But I would say triangulation occurs when you seek for higher authorities that you feel you can really trust. You have to believe in axiomatic truth on some level, that truth is there to be found. I think everyone has axiomatic truth. Even people who say, well, there is no such thing as axiomatic truth, that's their axiomatic truth. So everyone has an axiomatic truth that they start from when it comes to seeking answers about why we're here. And seeking answers about why we're here is just as natural an urge, as one of my teachers says, as it is to want to make love or have kids or eat food or build a house or whatever. The urge to want to know why we're here and where we come from is also natural. And just as there are ways of satisfying other urges, the axiomatic truth claim here is that there is higher truth to be known. And so I think that's where we start. And then from there, we start inquiring. And for some people in the very beginning of this means kind of learning about different paths, different philosophies, different schools of thinking, and continuing to sort of humbly ask for the truth and then consider it intelligently. Keeping a thankful and humble mood and continuing. And as you go, you pick up pieces of what feels like true, and you keep asking, and it helps you grow closer to something, may not come to the ultimate truth or anything, but you can gradually grow to kind of find your position in the stream. Where are my teachers? What path am I following? And like that. And then, it helps you, find a little bit of an anchor. So I think that's the process that I'm talking about right now. It doesn't have to be so cosmic and existential, like finding your teachers and finding the ultimate truth. And that's pretty big. In the weeks ahead, it might be just like, finding your way through some things that are happening at work, finding your way through some things that are happening at home or in relationships, and just trying to figure out, asking intelligent questions within or without, and considering them, contemplating them, really spending time with them, and then carefully coming to what you accept and what you reject, and then keep moving forward, discern your way forward, and keep asking more questions. So that's hopefully something of an answer to that question, Cheryl, and I hope that helps you. Okay, that's what I've got. I hope that you guys have a very good day today, and I hope that this was entertaining and helpful for all of you. Okay, I hope you have a great week. Bye.